Delighted to see you all here. This is a beautiful time of the year. John Deak is a Nanovic Fellow, one of our faculty fellows. He's assistant professor of history here, specializing in modern Europe, particularly imperial and political history. His PhD is from the University of Chicago. He came to Notre Dame in 2009 and has been teaching modern German history, revolutions, philosophy of history, historical methods, as well as a graduate course on nationalism. He's also been finishing his first book on the constitutional and political history of Central Europe, entitled Power and the Politics of State in Imperial Austria, 1848 to 1914. Kind of in the time period of the talk tonight, in which the Habsburg Monarchy and its bureaucratic expression looms pretty large. He also continues to publish in journals, organize professional meetings, and most recently organizing a symposium with the Institute, in fact, in London, on the understanding and use of the British Constitution. I use that in quotes because, as we know, the British Constitution is not written in Central European politics. Recently, Professor Deak has begun work on emergency legislation and the relationship of civilian and military authorities during the First World War, which brings us to the subject of this lecture. So he is, as the Habsburg Monarchy's first role in the First World War tends to be not forgotten, but certainly, interestingly, pushed to the side a little bit as people focus on the Western Front. Of course, Central Europe and the Eastern Front is a major facet of the war, should not be forgotten. And so we have Professor Deak here to remind us of the Great War's forgotten realm. Enjoy.
Well, I want to thank everyone for coming and just say, first of all, how delighted I am to speak to what is for me kind of a home audience of maybe friendly people. Maybe. I want to thank Jim McAdams and Anthony Monta and the Nanovic Institute for giving me this opportunity tonight. And I want to start with a bit of a caveat for you guys, and that is, I like to speak about research that is fairly fresh to me, and I haven't worked out yet. And especially in front of a home audience like this, I'd like to talk about my half-baked ideas, because I want your input. Maybe there are some ingredients I'm missing. This is one of my first lectures out of a work in progress in the Habsburg Empire in the First World War. So your comments, your frustrations with my presentation, your questions will be very helpful to me at this point in the project. I want to start tonight by getting us all on the same page with a bit of what I like to call historical mindfulness. And to think about, Anthony already is sort of taking issue with the title of my lecture, which is nice. The Great War's Forgotten Realm. He thinks it isn't forgotten, it's pushed to the side. And that gives me sort of a nice thought to begin with, that the act of forgetting is an act. It's an active thing that can be done. It's not something that we necessarily do passively. It can be an active thing. And so by beginning our historical mindfulness tonight, I want to give us all sort of a familiar, safe place to begin. Which I'll get to in a second. Our histories of the First World War, these things that have been selling like hotcakes off the shelves for maybe the last 2 or 3 years, because the centenary is with us, inevitably began in Sarajevo. Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, at this point in time, a Habsburg province, a colonial possession. We haven't made up our minds exactly what Bosnia-Herzegovina is in 1914. But our histories of the First World War start there. The heir to the Habsburg throne, the heir to Austria-Hungary, the future emperor, Franz Ferdinand, is assassinated along with his wife while on tour. It was their 14th wedding anniversary, or right around their 14th wedding anniversary. From here, when we write about the First World War, when we talk about the First World War, we quickly move on to the July Crisis, to the Great Powers, to the Anglo-German naval competition, to Russia's involvement in the East. We talk about the entangling system of European alliances, or we talk about the leaders of Europe stumbling, bumbling, and fumbling headfirst into the First World War. And at this point, the Habsburg Monarchy fades from view. But before we enter this world, again, let's start with a familiar place. Northern Indiana, a place near and dear to all of our hearts, right? I want us to start here and think for a moment about histories about remembering and forgetting. And I want to start with a place on campus that I thought I knew exactly what it was about, and I was surprised I didn't. This image is probably familiar to all of us. It's close to our hearts, and it's close to the hearts of the many Notre Dame football fans, some of which drive through campus and wonder what building Touchdown Jesus is on front of. This is the east entrance to the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, God Country Notre Dame. What does this mean? Or what meanings, better put, what meanings does it have? I had my own assumptions when I first came to Notre Dame and when I first arrived on campus. And this came out of my own background as a Catholic, grandchild of Eastern European immigrants, who, on a side note, when I came here from the University of Chicago, and my mother, daughter of a coal miner, when she found out I got a job here, I spoke to her on the phone. I said, "Mom, they gave me a job at Notre Dame. I'm going to Notre Dame." And she said, "Oh, John, I'm so happy for you. You're finally somewhere that I've heard of." And in this worldview, which I can't help but carry with me everywhere I go, God Country Notre Dame, for me, signified Notre Dame football, but it also signified a story of first Irish Catholics becoming American, and then people like me, child of and grandchild of Hunkies, becoming American as well. We brought with us our faith, which we kept and we put first, and then we assimilated to and took on the guise of Americans, a new country. And through football or through higher education, through social mobility, we loved Notre Dame. That's what I thought this was. And then I found out that this edifice wasn't built when the Basilica of the Sacred Heart was built. It came after. And if we pan back, we began to see what this is. Our gallant dead in glory everlasting, with 2 bronze plaques, the names of which on the plaques we can't read. This is a World War I memorial. And like here, well, the plaques, I never got maybe someone here in the question and answer can tell me if the plaques are the dead, alumni, students, staff, faculty, or if they're just the names of people who served in American regiments in the First World War. I don't know what they signify. I don't know exactly what they signify. If we look up when we enter or leave the Basilica, we can really take it in that this is a World War I memorial. There's a doughboy helmet there holding the light, and there are the regiments, the units that the U.S. soldiers served in from Notre Dame. The one I recognize first off is the Rainbow Division from Kansas City, up there in the top left. This is a silent memorial. I didn't know anything about this. In fact, when I go to Mass at the Basilica, this is the entrance I use. I've walked through there hopefully hundreds of times. I don't want to count. I've missed a couple. But I want to ask today, why is it that this narrative of World War I memorial that God, Country, Notre Dame signifies, why is this not the first message for many of us? What other stories are there that have replaced it? Is this an active forgetting or is this a passive forgetting? Now, I have a kind of smarmy answer. This t-shirt you can buy for $30 online or at the Hammes bookstore. And my smarmy answer is that other stories tend to dominate or crowd out original meanings, original intentions, original purposes. Or maybe they're people no longer, the people who could tell the stories of the original edifice are no longer living, or we're no longer listening to them in general. And while maybe the original meanings of God, Country, Notre Dame have been suppressed or even forgotten, right? The phrase itself isn't left in history's dustbin. It takes on new meanings. It takes on the meanings I had for it. I don't know. It would be interesting for me if you could share what God, Country, Notre Dame says to you. And this leads me to the general problem about history, about commemorating or remembering and forgetting. Because when we commemorate one thing, we inevitably don't say other things. This is just the nature of not having enough time and words to express maybe everything that is there. I think history, if I can become more general at this moment, has become more esoteric over the last 30 years. But some of the ideas that have emerged out of historical discourse and historical theory nowadays place the task on historians to recapture the silences of the past or old stories, old meanings that have been forgotten or pushed to the side. And that's part of my goal here tonight, to think about this, and to think about this in terms of the Habsburg monarchy. What I'd like to do tonight is give us a lecture about historiography. And I want to try to identify for you guys sort of the groupthink that has happened among historians, public intellectuals, and journalists about the First World War when dealing with the Habsburg Empire. And maybe to think about what happens if the Habsburg monarchy is not any longer a forgotten realm in the First World War. So this is it. In 1914, Austro-Hungarian Empire was a great power. It was a major player in the center of the European continent. It had embassies all over the world. It was a major source of international trade. But for us, when we think about the First World War, the Habsburg monarchy does not fit into the narratives, the large narratives that we've constructed for it. And especially in the history of Western civilization, for those classes, those big classes that historians have to teach about European history, the Habsburg monarchy doesn't fit neatly into our paradigms at all. It doesn't fit neatly into our ideas about how states should evolve and what should happen. For instance, we don't really know how to deal with a Europe that's emerging into or forming large nation states when we have an empire that has 13 different national or linguistic groups. People in the Habsburg Empire spoke German, they spoke Hungarian, they spoke Italian, Czech, Slovak, Slovene, Serbo-Croatian, if we want to call that one language. They didn't at the time. Romanian, Ukrainian, Polish, and lest we forget, Yiddish. I've always thought that this place was an important place. It started when I was a 5-year-old, and my grandparents told me the part of the world they came from. And of course, being a 5-year-old, when I looked at the old maps, this was the second biggest country in Europe, second only to Russia. Of course, the bigger the things are, the more important they are. And I've kind of held on to that childish naivete. Maybe not to my detriment. My first book, which Anthony mentioned, is actually, I think, as of today in production. We'll see. Keep your fingers crossed. It was a political history of the Habsburg imperial bureaucracy. I wanted in this book to trace Austria's public administration, its civil servants, from its origins in the Enlightenment to its dismantling under a Catholic priest in Austria, in the Austrian Republic, in the 1920s. My story was a story of state building, infrastructure building, a story of educated men learning languages and trying to lay the groundwork for economic expansion, education, and even political participation, to forge a democracy. In some ways, I really hope to understand how the age of security, in the famous sort of phrase of Stefan Zweig, this great Viennese Jewish writer from the turn of the century through the Second World War, called the Habsburg Monarchy and Europe before the First World War, the age of security. I wanted to understand how this age of security in this empire was formed. And one of the metaphors that I thought through this, dealing with my bureaucrats and politicians and infrastructure building, was that of dancing. Bureaucrats and politicians dancing together. One led, the other followed. But I had a problem. I had a problem trying to turn this dissertation into a book manuscript. And that was, when I started to do research, when I started to write about the First World War, all the threads that I could follow from 1780 to 1914 completely disappeared. So I did what any assistant professor aspiring to tenure at a major research university would do. I ended my first book in 1914 and started a second book on the First World War. There was a different story I had to tell. When I started to write about the First World War, when I started to think about all the threads that I had been following in my research, how they disappeared, the first thing I noticed when reading the literature, when reading historiography, and when looking through my own research, was that everything changed. The historiography, the people who write about the First World War, who write about the Habsburg Monarchy, have completely different attitudes. They have completely different assumptions. And the evidence they use is much different too. And I think, in general, when writing about the First World War, historians of the Habsburg Monarchy have a problem. Our historical subject claims the world stage for a brief moment. From June 28, 1914, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand is shot, to July 28, 1914, when the Habsburg Empire declares war on Serbia. That's it. General treatments of the First World War devote some attention to the Habsburg Empire, to its domestic situation, to its geopolitical situation. But for me, as a Habsburg historian, I feel when I'm reading this stuff as if I'm watching these old Star Trek episodes. What happens to the guy in the red shirt? Any Trekkies here? If you meet an Ensign Johnson in the first 5 minutes and Captain Kirk talks to him, and mentions him by name, so maybe as a viewer, you're supposed to know who this guy is. What's going to happen to Ensign Johnson? He's going to die at the climax right before that 15-minute mark where the commercial sets in. And so historians of the First World War generally develop some interest in the Habsburg monarchy. They do it with certain tropes that I'm going to talk about. And then they either forget it or they kill it off. Where this comes from, I think, is how we position the First World War within general historiography. It's been cast as an historical breaking point, a cataclysm, when the golden epoch of the 19th century Europe comes crashing to an end. And within this emplotment, people who write about the First World War must say something about the empire taking up such a large portion of the map of Europe. But they say it's an anachronism, that it's doomed, that it can't survive. Because the 20th century is going to be a much different century. And the Habsburg Empire isn't equipped to survive into it. So within Habsburg studies, and within First World War studies for a long time, there was a sense of agreement. Within our larger, long accepted views in the Habsburg monarchy, this thing is seen and written about as a weak political anachronism. And when we take historians like Robert Kahn, who was an Austrian Jew, immigrated to the United States in 1938. He had a law degree from the University of Vienna, but of course, in the US, he couldn't use it. He went to Columbia University and received a PhD in history, and taught the history of the place that he had come from. Kahn saw the Habsburg monarchy as doomed. And the First World War for Kahn was the fulfillment of a long-term disintegration process. He writes that the disintegration process is an important chapter in the history of the Habsburg monarchy, but it's still one chapter in a long chain of events. What happened in a few years, that is in the First World War, is only an abstract of a long-out process of decline. The Habsburg monarchy was doomed to dissolution. That's a major trope we see within Habsburg studies up until about 1980. The other trope is the Habsburg monarchy, what I like to call the Habsburg monarchy is a storage container. We call it maybe the repressive prison of nations, doomed to dissolution, or we can see it as the storage container that holds in all of these nations of the monarchy wanting to be free. And the First World War is this point in time that opens the gates of this prison and lets all the prisoners out. These prisoners are Czechs, Slovaks, Romanians, Yugoslavians, and Poles, not Ukrainians, because they entered another prison, didn't they? At least in this literature. This narrative, the history of the Habsburg monarchy, is a storage container that's broken open by the First World War, largely fits into the paradigm of the nation states that succeeded it, national histories. And it also fits very well into the First World War as being this modern cataclysm that breaks open Central Europe. What we're going to see is a persistence in the literature of these myths at the level of First World War studies. The trope that the Habsburg monarchy in 1914 was on the verge of collapse and the First World War just broke it open is something that you're going to see again and again in World War I literature that's still being published today. One of my favorite examples is Norman Stone. In 2009, he published this book with Basic Books. He writes that Austria-Hungary was an anachronism. He begins his book on the First World War from the standpoint of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in 1918. He says that Germany was set to rule Europe economically, but it had a fatal flaw. Its plan had a fatal flaw. and that was its ally, the Habsburg Monarchy. He writes, Austria-Hungary, Germany's only real ally, would soon disintegrate. The signs of that were all around. In an age of nationalism, this vast multinational empire was an anachronism. And then he adds, there were 15 different versions of the imperial anthem, the Gott erhalte, including a Yiddish one. I guess when people start singing in Yiddish, you can be sure that whatever is going on isn't modern. Other tropes are repeated through the literature. These are some of my favorites that I pulled out of things published between 2000 and 2014. In fact, 2 years ago, I hired two undergraduates to go through a list of World War I books and just write down what they say about the Habsburg Monarchy. The Habsburg Monarchy was a holdover from the Middle Ages. So was France, England, Russia, Iceland. Even Poland, I guess, could be a holdover from the Middle Ages. Its roots went back to the coronation of Charlemagne. Not quite. It was a ramshackle structure, fearful of its too many Slavs. Okay, that's why the Slavs were serving as prime ministers and foreign ministers. And it was the new sick man of Europe. So for historians like me, dealing with a literature like this, coming out of a long 19th century perspective, writing a book about infrastructure building, about a vibrant monarchy, I feel like when I work on the First World War, when I read books that were published 2 weeks ago on the First World War, that I'm entering an alternative universe. All the faces are familiar, the names are even spelled the same, but their personalities are different. And I get gems like these. Of course, there are other stories we could tell, other stories that World War I historians don't like to tell. And I'll start off with this image. This is a memorial to Franz Ferdinand, erected by the people of Sarajevo. It was erected in 1916. It was torn down in 1919. It was purposefully forgotten. In other parts of Central Europe after the First World War, there were many statues that were torn down. There were busts of Joseph II, statues of Franz Josef, even statues of Maria Theresia, torn down. But if we look closely and if we're careful, we can see other monuments of the Habsburg monarchy that are still there. They take the form of post offices, train stations, university buildings, tram lines, railroads, canals, bridges. For some reason, the state of Czechoslovakia didn't want to tear down the bridges in Prague, right? So what this gets me to is, within Habsburg studies, the milieu that I come out of, we have a completely different perspective on the First World War. We write about national indifference, that the Habsburg monarchy wasn't being torn apart by nationalism. In fact, many people didn't identify with a singular national group. We talk about political deal-making and cooperation. We don't talk about parliaments rioting. We talk about local and, at the same time, multinational politics. We talk about things like Kindertausch, where Czechs in the village sent their kids to live with a German-speaking family over the summer because they had more economic opportunities. And even German-speaking families in the same village sending their kids to live with Czechs. And of course, we talk about loyalty, this creation of a supranational identity that was imperial, that was Habsburg. This is the stuff that we write about. And in fact, there's a whole new revisionist school within Habsburg history. So there's more people than just me in this world who reads World War I history and says, what in the world is going on? The problem is that we don't talk to each other. So what I've seen in the last 30 years, looking back at the historiography, is a complete and utter gap between what World War I historians who write about the First World War in general say about the Habsburg Empire and what Habsburgists like me, sorry about that, not used to being mic'd up, say about the Habsburg Empire. We don't talk to each other. There is this historiographic gap. And part of this is our fault. There are people, academically cowardly like me, wanting to get tenure, who end our political histories, who end our cultural histories, who end our social histories in 1914. The First World War is a completely different animal. It is. But we've left it to the generalists, who I don't think have read a book published in the Habsburg Monarchy in the last 30 years. And besides, our narrative of political vibrancy of the Habsburg Monarchy doesn't fit into a neat box on the First World War. No one wants to really explain, if this monarchy was vibrant, then why did it die? Which is a big question. And we see really the persistence, despite even, I've seen historians footnote new literature on the Habsburg monarchy and not use it. And one of my favorite episodes comes out of the First World War DVD set, the special documentary that was done by Channel 4 in Great Britain, under the direction of Hugh Strachan, the probably foremost military historian of the First World War right now. The narrator tells us in the first 10 minutes of this 10-plus hour documentary that the empire was ruled by Franz Ferdinand's uncle, Franz Joseph. He sat on 2 thrones. Just imagine that for a second. I like to imagine that. As Emperor of Austria and King of Hungary. By 1914, Franz Joseph had been in charge for 66 years. He spent those years trying to resist change of any kind. They built bridges, railroads, post offices, drove cars. He spent those years trying to resist change of any kind. For countries like Serbia, Austria-Hungary was a prison of nations, a repressive, undemocratic state that ground small peoples under its heel. That might be said of Yugoslavia, right? In 1905, there were nationalistic demonstrations in Vienna. In 1912, there was rioting in Budapest. What was going on in New York and Chicago and Cleveland at the same time? In other words, we get the same trope of absolutism and anarchy. So my starting point, I'm not going to go on until 7 o'clock, but my starting point in this project are these types of historiographic questions. How do we bridge the gap? And more importantly, after Franz Ferdinand is killed, after the July crisis, after July 28th, 1914, what happens? Let me sum up in a very brief way. Austria-Hungary fought the First World War almost until its very end. It dissolved in the last 2 weeks of October 1918. Its casualties, dead, 1.1 million, which was 19 men per 1,000. A higher casualty rate than Britain, a higher casualty rate than Canada, a higher casualty rate than Australia. It was lower than France and lower than Germany. I think the war killed this empire in a dramatic way. But since the 1920s, since the formation of new nation states in Central Europe, this idea, the First World War killed this empire in a dramatic way, has been completely downplayed. We kill it off like the man in the red shirt in the Star Trek episodes. So maybe we can switch the way we think about this, right? Maybe we can ask what fell in 1918. I think our general understanding of Austria-Hungary by 1918 is that it was an anachronistic multinational state or a repressive empire that could not be held together. It had become unnatural. And we have maps in the 1930s that stem from the 1930s that try to show us this by showing the distribution of races. This is what the map is titled, Distribution of Races. Now, of course, we have lots of different colors here. But what it doesn't tell us is how much of this place was actually multinational. We only have one color representing each area. But there's layers of colors that are hidden. If you're going to agree with me, or at least agree with my conceit for the purpose of this lecture, that the Habsburg state wasn't a prison of the peoples, if we shouldn't see it in terms of its metaphorical usefulness in First World War studies as a backward reactionary anachronism, then how should we see it? And how should views like mine that come out of a revisionist school, how can they affect the First World War and the Habsburg specific work on the First World War? Historians of the Habsburg Monarchy don't deal with the fact that this thing fell. Historians of the First World War don't deal with the fact that this thing didn't have to fall, that it wasn't about to fall. How do we put these things together? How do we bridge these historiographies? And maybe how do we put the monarchy back into the center of the First World War? Why did the monarchy fall so utterly? I think we need to be aware of the fact, first of all, that we read the past just like we see the God country Notre Dame freeze today, through the present. And we have maps like this that show us sort of a neat national division in Europe. And we see this as more natural than what was there before. And I'm not great with PowerPoint, but it took me about 16 tries to try to trace the Habsburg monarchy on the current map of Europe. I think I got it. If you see what I've enclosed in red as maybe a common space, instead of looking through the map of today, I think maybe we can become more aware, more mindful of all the what-ifs, all the roads not taken, all the possibilities lost that were part of the past. And then the First World War can gain even more significance because it interrupted and ended those things. I want to start by detailing some research that's been done in this vein that really attacks common sense interpretations of what happened in the First World War that have been with us since the 1920s. And the first comes about the Czech Infantry Regiment number 28. Infantry Regiment number 28 is famous. It's famous because, as the story goes, on the Eastern Front in early 1915, the regiment betrayed the monarchy and gave themselves up wholesale to the Russians. Betraying all the other regiments around them that were being close to annihilated by the Russians because they were in the line and they didn't hold it. They surrendered. The story of Infantry Regiment 28 was used by the first generation of Austrian historians who published the official history of Austria's last war in 1930. The commission of historians who wrote this, it's in our library. I see Julie Tanaka is in the audience. She and other people here bought this for me, all 15 volumes. The historians who did this, who produced this major work, were the former generals of the Habsburg army. And they made the argument that the Slavs of the empire stabbed it in the back. The reason the Habsburg monarchy fell was because of our Slavic soldiers who were unreliable. Therefore, it wasn't our fault. It wasn't the general's fault. Now, Infantry Regiment 28 was also used at the same time by Czech politicians. In fact, it was argued that the Czechs were always anti-Austrian, they were always anti-imperial, they were always Democrats. And we can see this in Infantry Regiment 28, which gave up. What really happened, I think, was that this regiment was surrounded and annihilated. But in 1916, when all the political parties in Austria were not in parliament, but still politically active, German nationalists were upset because Czech areas were getting in a shipment of coal, large shipments of coal that they wanted to go to German-speaking areas. And so they produced for the government, or they presented to the government, a 450-page report on the betrayal of Infantry Regiment 28 to try to make a political argument. It wasn't true, it was completely fabricated, and it was ignored. But nonetheless, they tried to tarnish the role of this regiment in order to make a political case on something what today would seem minor, a shipment of coal. The two founders of Czechoslovakia, Edvard Beneš and Thomas Masaryk, got a hold of this report in 1916. And they took it to the Allies. And they said, look, the Czechs are your allies. We need you to dismantle the Habsburg monarchy. They took the same report, fabricated by German nationalists, and put a reverse spin on it. And used it then, in the 1920s, to prop up a myth of Czechoslovakia. And it was only in 2006, 2007 that this real story was unearthed. And I've seen historians of the First World War write the same thing over and over again about the failure and the disloyalty of the Slavs. This stuff is ignored. My own work is cast in the same sort of field about Austria's internal war. And I've been working on the state of exception and what happens to the Austrian state. What I'm trying to explain in my own research about the First World War is how, if the Habsburg monarchy was vibrant, if it was a functioning state under the rule of law, what happened in the First World War? And an oversimplification that I'll throw out right now is that Dr. Jekyll becomes Mr. Hyde. What we see in the Habsburg monarchy, what I see in my own work, is that emergency legislation passed in the early days of the First World War was all supposed to be temporary. It was supposed to accompany mobilization. The Habsburg state had all of this emergency legislation in place, just like the other powers of Europe, in case of a major war. Democracies do this. But what happens? Emergency legislation is passed in July 1914, July 26th. By August 25th, 1914, 1 month later, the Russians have taken over large parts of Polish Galicia and the Bukovina, overrunning the capitals, pushing the Austrian armed forces back, destroying, in the first 4 months of the war, the entire professional Austro-Hungarian army. So Austria-Hungary is in a constant state of emergency. This legislation that's supposed to accompany mobilization is never lifted. And so the army stays in control of domestic policy making until late 1916. And in the process of being paranoid, of dealing with extraordinary losses, they fight a campaign against their own people. They fight a war against priests in Slovene-speaking regions. because they're being denounced by local Germans. And they fight a war on language in southern Hungary, trying to erase Serbian and erase the word Serbo-Croatian and just replace it with Croatian. They do this in Italy, in the Trentino as well. So what happens is that this long war that comes out of 1914 that no one expected, and the severe losses that Austria-Hungary underwent in early 1914, which meant that emergency legislation was never lifted as it was supposed to be, meant that the state that I've worked on, this bureaucratic state trying to manage democracy, build infrastructure, make sure everyone's happy, is completely thrown out the window. And by the time 1917 comes around and the army is displaced and Parliament is reopened, there's no way to put the thing back together again. In the midst of all this, we also have stories that are not told about the amazing resilience of the monarchy. The fact that Austria-Hungary raised 3 armies between 1914 and 1918. I mean that its army was destroyed 3 times. We forget that Austria-Hungary's war aims had been achieved by 1918. Everything that they set out to do in 1914, by 1918 was finished. And we also don't read about those 1.1 million dead being mainly Slavs who supposedly betrayed the monarchy. So yes, the monarchy fell, but was it really on the brink of collapse? Now, what does this kind of stuff tell us? What I want to do is say that the First World War was actually really important for the Habsburg monarchy. And we need to understand that the First World War radically changed things in Central Europe. That up until this point, because we believe that the monarchy was a prison of the peoples and in a long-term decline, we've completely undersold the major transformative effects of the First World War. So we need to re-examine a lot of our suppositions, and we need to actually give the First World War more credit than we do. We also need to change the way we think about this place. We need to change our paradigms. I think if we tune our focus to understanding why an old empire, which was continually evolving and building new loyalties, and building railroads, and building infrastructure, and paving maybe the way for multinational democracy, how something like this can collapse so quickly and so utterly, and how the war did this, we might understand the First World War in new and important ways. Maybe even the Habsburg monarchy in its story can speak to First World War historians. We also might want to rethink our timeline. We go under the assumption that the First World War ended in 1918. But the fall of the Habsburg monarchy and the creation of new nation states produced ethnic cleansing, a continuation of war, a continuation of starvation, and new economic battles between these new nation states that used to be in a customs union together. By 1922, just to give you an example, a League of Nations officials authored an article on the economic disaster that continued after the First World War. He wrote this in 1922. That Austria lived but pitifully and precariously. She froze in winter, and a larger part of her population was hungry throughout the year. Her middle class was almost destroyed, and it was a common sight to see scientists or historians of European reputation ill-clad and obviously starved. The mortality was high, and among children, terrible. War, starvation, the continuation of this thing in the continent of Europe, in the place that the Habsburg monarchy occupied, and of course the place that the Russian Empire occupied, continued into the 1920s. I think the real tragedy of the First World War And maybe the tragedy, the first seminal tragedy, the seminal catastrophe of the 20th century may actually be a Habsburg story. The Great War ended the possibilities and the furthering of multinationalism in Europe. And I think instead of seeing the war as a moment which sealed the coffin of the Habsburg monarchy and which led the imprisoned nations out of their jail, we need to look at what kinds of processes the war interrupted and what future multinational polity disappeared from view. I think these questions are once again, with the return to multinationalism, the idea of the supranational state in Europe, I think are more fitting questions to ask of Europe's past, something that I want to see First World War historians start to do. And of course, I think this is a past, a European past, which just like in this map, the Habsburg Empire stands in the very center. So thank you very much.
There's a lot to think about there, and you can just open the floor to questions.
Yeah,
you don't need to take.
Sure. You want to raise the light so I can see people? That's okay? Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm happy to keep talking, though. You might have one thing. Please, Tom.
There's one element that I want you to talk a little bit more about that seems to break from the general idea that you're making, and it's the action of the Austrian and Hungarian military against national minorities, starting with the emergency legislation. It seems that that doesn't fit the overall story. So could you explain why they're doing that? Given the story that you explained of a multinational that's working well together, why wasn't this perceived by the military leaders, and why did they take actions that then undermine the success story that you're trying to tell?
I have two ways of approaching it. I'm going to do the first one, which is going to sound slightly flippant, and that is, it's surprising to many people, historians, but also politicians and people in charge of the Habsburg Monarchy, that the army did this, because they were the quintessential multinational organization before 1914. That being said, things that politicians, people who were in charge of running civilian governments in the Habsburg Monarchy didn't see was that leading up into the First World War, the army was developing and articulating internally an anti-political habitus. And we can see this in sort of discussions about irredentism and irredentism, like the role of Italians in southern First Monarchy, Serbians, Slavs, Poles, Ukrainians. The army was becoming increasingly disaffected with democracy and multinational politics. There is one anecdote about it, there's a famous history of the Habsburg military. Talks about sort of the quaintness of this multinational army in the period leading up to the First World War. About the Radetzky March and this great scene. The Radetzky March is one of the only famous novels about the Habsburg Monarchy in the English language now. Sunday afternoon, the military band strikes up a performance of the Radetzky March in the center of town square, and everybody comes to listen to it. And it's sort of this joviality of the military intermixing people. Military people, military bases, military units were stationed all over the monarchy, and they sent reports back to the war ministry about the crazy things that all these local politicians are doing. And this was happening from 1867 up until the First World War. And in reading these reports, and then seeing the military interact with civilian bureaucracy, you can see in marginal notes and in their own reports that they're starting to think any type of political participation, any type of democracy that's being practiced by non-Germans and non-Hungarians could possibly be separatist. The civilian leadership didn't think this at all, and they didn't see the military doing this. And so what happens is emergency legislation allows the military to kick in the door and to do all the things that they secretly wanted to do for a long time, but have been hiding from the rest of the polity. If that makes sense. Okay. Yes, sir.
You mentioned this emergency legislation,
Yeah.
but I thought in the summer of 1914 the Austrian Parliament was not in session.
It wasn't in session, but that has nothing to do with emergency legislation.
Well, who passed the legislation?
Parliament passed the legislation in 1868 that in the case of war, the emperor would hold political authority and military authority in his hands. In 1868, the emperor was 38 years old. In 1914, he was 84. But he still didn't let go of his power. And what this meant was that emergency legislation didn't just sort of suspend political activity. It gave precedence to military ideas in the allocation of resources and policing, especially. And the military just basically kicked the doors down for everything and tried to assert their own policies everywhere. They intervened in the administration of justice, food appropriation, transportation. And justice is where we see really a lot of crazy things going on. But this was only, the idea was that the emperor would keep this from happening. But when you have an 84-year-old emperor, he didn't keep it from happening. He tried to intervene and the military actually ignored it by this point. Yes, sir.
How well did democracy work in the Austro-Hungarian Empire? With that sort of slant, were all these different nationalities really represented? Did they have a true voice in the government?
National groups form parties, typically. By this point, by 1914, a lot of national groups had not just one party, but a couple parties. A liberal party, a conservative party. And some, like the Poles, the liberals and conservatives would always vote as a bloc as Poles. So if we take the Poles, for instance, the Poles served in every government. They were represented in every government from the dawn of constitutionalism to the end of the monarchy. And Poles were involved in policy making all three. Sometimes Czech politicians boycotted parliament, and sometimes they didn't. The way democracy worked in the Habsburg Monarchy, so in these years, in these 50-odd years of constitutionalism, was that parties made deals. And sometimes they made deals when Parliament was in session, and sometimes they made deals when Parliament was out of session. But they made deals. And the broker of all of these deals was usually the bureaucracy. And so it was a managed democracy. But there was continual compromise. The budgets were passed. And what it also meant was that the government took a keen interest in keeping these national groups and these political parties happy by building post offices, by building schools, by building universities, by building roads. And of course the military was upset because those monies weren't going for guns and weren't going for a larger army. But like any democracy, right, you have factions and groups that are more powerful based on how much money they have, or, American democracy isn't always perfect either, in this sense. But the Habsburg democracy, its democratic system, at least in the Austrian half of the empire, it worked in deals. In the Hungarian half of the empire, not so much. The Hungarians dominated it. And the Hungarians had their own league to try to keep its national groups, mainly Romanians and Slovaks, from doing too much that they didn't like. That was probably going to change. See, the Hungarians by 1910, 1912, realizing that they had to start using a democratic system.
But the monarchy really had most of the power. Was it kind of like Germany at this time with the Reichstag and all of this?
I'd say that
the Kaiser had the power that Bismarck set all this up,
No, I think in the Habsburg monarchy had a lot more devolved political power in Germany. It was not as, the Kaiser wasn't a deus ex machina and could sort of fly and change everything like he could in Germany. In the Habsburg monarchy, budgets had to be passed, and the people had to, the citizens, the bureaucracy had to pass it. Not the bureaucracy working with politicians had to pass a budget. And so what you see is the political groups in the Habsburg Empire really could have a strong voice, and they could disrupt things. And so it was always the government's job to keep them happy. Everybody awake? I had one of those soothing voices. All right, well, thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you taking time to participate.